voted on it. Y'all wished for it. And so we're going to be doing something a little bit differently today. Instead of looking at some old, dead white guy, well, coincidentally, we are looking at a philosopher who's old and dead and white. But we're not looking at a historical figure. We're not looking at what you might call a philosophical theory that's important in the history of philosophy. What we're doing today is something much more fun. We're going to talk about time travel and time travel paradoxes. I'm sure you've all watched science fiction, right? All these different time travel shows and movies that come at it in different ways. Well, if we think about time travel logically, certain strange paradoxes arise, and it's not clear how they can be understood, what we're supposed to think about them. We're just going to explore some of those today. So it's going to be pretty casual, pretty informal. I'm actually going to be showing y'all a PowerPoint after I do some introductory stuff. Yeah, it's going to be pretty cool, I hope. Mostly discussion based. I don't have too much that I need to spew at you. Okay, so I asked you to read for today an article by David Lewis, who was an American philosopher, very analytical guy, influential in the 20th century, especially for American philosophy, analytic philosophy. He came up with a bunch of ideas that we still talk about today with regards to what we call counterfactuals, possible worlds. But we're going to be investigating his analysis of time travel paradoxes today. In order to do that, though, I need to kind of give you some ideas that have come out of philosophy recently to help you make sense of how we can think about these problems and how they make sense. So the first thing I want to tell you all about is this thing called temporal parts. This is a concept that has emerged within the last few decades that's related to the philosophy of time. We're all familiar with things having spatial parts. That is, just look at your own body, right? You have a hand, you have an arm, you have a head, you have a torso. All of these things exist in space. They're spatially extended, okay? This piece of chalk, it has a left side, it has a right side, it has a middle. These are its spatial parts, right? Just the parts of an object extended in space. Well, in order to make sense of time travel, philosophers have come up with this concept called temporal parts. They're going to say, not only do things in our universe have spatial parts that are extended in space, but they also have these weird things called temporal parts. So you can think about it like this. All objects exist at some point in space, but what an object is also the collection of all of its temporal parts that are existing at particular points in time. So let's take the human person, for example. With regards to its spatial parts, we've already kind of talked about it. Like, look, it's got an arm, 2 arms in fact, it's got a head, it's got legs, and so on. Well, in the philosophy of time, we can also think about an object having these things called temporal parts that are distinct, but that exist at particular times. So let's call the time right now T0, what is it? 9:49 p.m. or a.m., sorry, on Wednesday, September, what is it? The 20th? 2023, right? According to the temporal parts theory, objects, including people, have basically an infinite number of parts that exist at particular slices in time. So at the next moment in time, you can imagine this is 9:49, 0:00:0:0. At 9:49, 0:00:0:0:0:1, the next moment in time, this thing has a different part that's existing at that time. So it's like a weird idea to wrap your head around, but the main idea is this. It's possible to go back in time and talk to yourself or speak to yourself or interact with yourself because a different part of you is existing at that time. Does that make sense? That's why in these time travel shows in movies, people are often talking to themselves in the past. How is that possible? Well, according to philosophers, it's possible because it's just a different part of them that exists at that time. So the part that's existing in the present is talking to the part that's existing in the past when they go into the past. So just as things have spatial parts, things also have temporal parts, these philosophers are going to argue. So what makes a thing on this view is going to be its set, the total collection of its spatial parts and its temporal parts. So that's why it's possible for people to talk to themselves that are in the future or in the past, because you have one part talking to another part. Each of these parts are distinct, they're separate. It's the total collection of these parts that makes you completely you. So, for example, if you go into the past and talk to yourself, you're only talking to a part of yourself. You're not talking to your complete self, if that makes sense. Because the part that's existing at that time is just that. It's a part. It's not the complete you. So, anything that exists in the universe, these philosophers are going to say, have both of these kinds of parts. Spatial parts and temporal parts. Let's see, can you read my weird cursive? So that is one concept that we need to have some sort of grasp on. That can explain why it's, or how it might be possible for people to talk to themselves. In the past, the future, interact with themselves, etc. It's one concept that we can use to make sense of that possibility. Another thing that we need to think about or consider is the nature of time travel itself. So movies and shows do this differently. We don't think time travel has been invented so far. If it has, I certainly don't know of it. But time travel could work in a number of different ways. A weird way to describe this is that time travel can take no time at all, or it can take time. And it depends on the mode of time travel that we're engaging in. So, for example, let's say you build a time travel machine and you have to turn on the machine, and it winds up, and you sit in it. You know, it starts vibrating or whatever, and then eventually you just disappear, and you're going back to the past. Your journey back to the past can happen instantaneously, or it can happen after a certain amount of time. And this is how it's depicted in shows and movies, right? In a lot of shows and movies, you see this scene where the person is like, I don't know, flying through this weird zone, and then all of a sudden they show up in the past, right? And a certain amount of time from their perspective has elapsed since when they press the button on the machine and when they show up in the past. So it took some time to get back to the past from their perspective. But time travel doesn't have to be like that. When we think about, for example, wormholes, which are portals in space-time, it's theorized that if you jumped into a wormhole, you would just instantaneously appear at another point in space and time. It wouldn't actually take any time to get there. You understand what I mean? So sometimes time travel is depicted in that way. Sometimes time travel is depicted as instantaneous. Sometimes time travel is depicted as, well, according to the person traveling, from their point of view, it looks like it does take time. Is this making sense so far? These ideas? Okay. It might be helpful now to introduce another distinction, which is going to help us talk about these different time travel paradoxes, which might help us make sense of this idea too. And that's the distinction between what we might call internal time and external time. Okay? And this is something that Lewis actually talks about in this article, The Paradoxes of Time Travel. When we're talking about time travel, we kind of invoke two different times. One time that we talk about, we might call external time. This is the time that we're all experiencing right now and living through, that we think in some sense is like objective. Time is, pulling us towards the future or carrying us along with it, and we're all part of this. We're all existing at the same time in this present moment, and we're all being carried towards the future. This is what we might call external time. It's the time that we invoke when we're talking about, time has a flow and we're all headed in the same direction. We might summarize it or define it as the time that we are all participating in, which is flowing towards the future. But when we talk about time travel, when we talk about somebody going from the present to the past or from the present to the future or whatever it is, we also invoke this thing called internal time or personal time. This is time seen from the point of view of the time traveler. The time that the time traveler experiences, okay? And here's what I mean by that. We just got done invoking this idea that time travel can take no time at all, or it can take time. Well, when I made that distinction, that was invoking personal time. Okay? From the point of view of the time traveler, it either takes no time at all to get to the past, or it takes some amount of time from their point of view. Right? Maybe it's instantaneous, they just hop in a wormhole and they're in the past immediately. Or maybe, it takes a while for the machine to wind up, and then all of a sudden they see all these crazy colors and things, and then they appear, right? Some sort of time from their point of view has elapsed, even though they're now in the past, right? So when we talk about traveling to the past, present, and future, let's say this is the present, future, past. When we talk about traveling to these different times, what we're invoking is external time, right? Oh yeah, Jim is going to go to the past, right? In these movies, Greg goes to the future, or whatever. But then when we're talking about the experience of the time traveler themselves, whether or not it takes time to get to the past or the future, we're invoking personal time. So you can think about external time as being like our objective picture of time. And you can think about personal time as being like how things appear, what things look like from the point of view of the time traveler. Does that make sense? Because these aren't going to line up, right, one to one. Because when the time traveler gets to the past, in his personal time, he's experiencing the present. Right? Because you can't experience any moment but the present, but objectively he went into the past. You see what I mean? Okay, so this is going to get really confusing and really difficult as we go through these paradoxes, but try to keep your head on straight. Okay? All right, so does this distinction make sense? All right, I'm going to assume that it does and that we're all on board. Now, I want to return just briefly to what Lewis has to say about temporal parts, because this is going to be important for how he analyzes and explains these different paradoxes in time travel. Okay? We can think of each temporal part as being its own separate person. Okay? This is how it's possible, theoretically, for you to talk to your past self. Yourself when you were 18 or whatever, or 12. It kind of presumes this idea that each temporal part is its own person that has its own agency, its own will, its own desires, so on and so forth, right? Because theoretically, if we imagine you meeting your past self, they can do what they want to do, right? They're going to think how they think. They're not going to be the same as you. They have their own will, right? Where this gets confusing is when we start talking about the relationships between the temporal parts of normal people and the temporal parts of a time traveler. Okay? Normal people, that is people who are not time travelers, okay? They have their temporal parts causally connected and continuous in external time. So what do I mean by that? Well, it's something like this. normal people, as we talked about before, right? All of their different temporal parts that exist at these different times, they're all causally connected, and they're headed towards the future, right? That's the direction that they're pointed at, or whatever. But the time traveler is a little different, okay? Because the time traveler can time travel, their temporal parts are not causally connected and continuous in external time, or what we might call objective time. The time traveler's temporal parts are causally connected and continuous in their personal time. Bless you. So from the point of view of objective time, the time traveler is bouncing all around, right? Let's say this is you, right? Right now, let's call that time t0. Well, if you go into the past at this moment, at time t1, which is the next moment in the future from now, you're not going to have a temporal part there, right? An external time if you go back in the past. Your next temporal part that's going to be causally connected to this one is going to be wherever you go into the past to. Does this make sense? So if we're comparing the temporal parts of a person who normally exists and somebody who is time traveling, their temporal parts, the time traveler, aren't going to be laid out towards the future like this. They're going to be in different points along the timeline because they are legitimately time traveling. So their temporal parts in their own personal time are going to be lined up and continuous, but in external time, the time traveler, its parts are going to look like this depending on how they time travel, right? Do you kind of understand what I'm saying? Yes or no? This is a weird idea. Let me try to just explain it one more time, and then we'll move on. The normal person, their temporal parts are all just lined up in the same direction from past to future, just one long continuous line. The time traveler's parts aren't lined up like that. If we call this temporal part 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on, for the time traveler, instead of it being sequential like that, it'll be like 1, and then 2, and then if they're living for a little while in the past, then 3, and then 4. Does that make sense? And then if they go back and time travel again, then this one's going to be 5. And then if they keep living there, 6. So it's not going to be laid out the same. Okay. I think I've explained it all right. With all of this now in our back pocket, these distinctions between personal time and external time, or what we might call the objective timeline, and temporal parts, we're able to talk about some of these weird paradoxes that fall out of time travel. Okay? Let's do it. It's going to be fun. To do so, I'm going to reuse a PowerPoint that I made last year rather than having to write all this stuff on the board. Okay? So one of the first things that Lewis brings up is this weird idea, reverse causation. Our normal experience of reality is this. When something causes something else to happen, the cause is in the past and the effect happens later, right? It's in the future. But if you're a time traveler, it doesn't always work this way. Cause and effect doesn't just always go from past to future. It can go from, present to past, for example. So we can have reverse causation. Here's a quote from the article. We might expect that when a time traveler visits the past, there will be reversals of causation. You may punch his face before he leaves, causing his eye to blacken centuries ago. Indeed, travel into the past necessarily involves reversed causation, for time travel requires personal identity. He who arrives must be the same person who departed. That requires causal continuity, in which causation runs from the earlier to later stages in the order of personal time. But the orders of personal time and external time disagree at some point for the time traveler. And there we have causation that runs from later to earlier stages in the order of external time. As I said at the outset, the time traveler's world would be a most strange one. So the idea is basically this. If time travel is possible, things in the present or in the future have caused things in the past to happen. That's really weird, right? That's not our normal experience of reality. Our normal experience of reality is things that are happening now cause things in the future to happen, not reversed. So that's really goofy, right? How can something that is happening now cause something in the past to happen? Isn't the past fixed? Isn't that set in stone already? That's strange, right? That's weird. So this is one of the paradoxes that falls out of time travel, reverse causation. The example he uses is punching a time traveler in the face before he leaves to go to the past will make him have a black eye in the past, which is not our normal experience of how the universe works. Normally, stuff happening now causes stuff to happen later, and that's the order that it has always gone. But if time travel is possible, it can go the other way too. Stuff now can cause stuff in the past to happen, to have happened, if we're going to be grammatically correct, which is strange. But this isn't even the weirdest thing, okay? There are a lot more weird paradoxes that fall out of this. For example, like causal loops. Here's what Lewis has to say about that. Recall the time traveler who talked to himself in the past. He talked to himself about time travel, and in the course of the conversation, his older self told his younger self how to build a time machine. That information was available in no other way. His older self knew how because his younger self had been told, and the information had been preserved by the causal processes that constitute recording, storage, and retrieval of memory traces. His younger self knew how to build a time machine after the conversation because his older self had known, and the information had been preserved by the causal processes that constitute telling. But where did the information come from in the first place? Why did the whole affair happen? There is simply no answer. So this is the scenario he asks us to picture. You get a time machine, and you go into the past, and you tell your younger self how to build a time machine. Your younger self knows how to build a time machine because you told them. Well, now notice what happens here, okay? Here's your older self. Let's call him OS. Here's your younger self, YS. This older self has the knowledge of how to build a time machine, and they go back in the past and tell your younger self. Your younger self is only able to build the time machine because the older self told them, which guarantees the possibility that in the future, again, you go back into the past and tell yourself. But if the younger self only knew how to build the time machine from the older self, then where did the older self get that information? If this is true, if the younger self had always and only known how to build a time machine because of the older self, then where the hell did this one get that information in the first place? Because it's always been the case that the younger self only knew because the older self told them. Do you see the weird loop that's caused here? Where the fuck did the information come from of how to build a time machine? If it's always been the case that in the past, the younger self only knew because the older self told them. Where did the older self get the information? This is weird, right? How do we explain this? What's going on here? What do y'all think? Or is this just frying your brain? You're like, I don't fucking get it. I don't want to get it. Yeah. Okay, talk about that. What happens in that show?
So he goes back in time like a lot, and it causes a lot of these paradoxes.
Yeah.
And like the way they like explain it is like whenever you create a paradox, it creates like a separate like objective timeline where that is true, like in your original timeline it's not true, which gets confusing as well.
So that's another thing, like, that's something that we don't have a good grasp on, is how does time actually work, right? We have this, there are competing conceptions here in our minds, right? We normally think this is how time works, right? It's flowing from the past to the future, and what happens in the past is fixed, right? You can't change it because it's already happened. Right? That's the way it's been. It's set in stone. If that's true, if the past is fixed, it gives rise to a paradox like this. But maybe that's not how time works. Maybe the past is not fixed, and when you do go back into the past and change something, maybe it causes another timeline to split off. Maybe. But how would that work? That there would be two timelines existing at the same time? Like, how is that possible? How does that work? How do the laws of physics allow for that? Like two different realities existing at the same time? That's weird, right?
What if there was an older self who learned it later on, and then they went back to tell their younger self? And the older self had learned it, and that thing was like, younger self, you can make this now with this information I've got. And then it created a loop where now there's a new older self who only got it from the other guy.
So that would have to involve us thinking the past is not fixed, right? Because if that story is going to be true, the older self like read it in a book and then went back into the past to tell the younger self, you have changed the timeline, right? Because you've given your younger self, which is you, 20 years ago, information that you didn't originally have. So that would have to, if we're going to accept that story, we'd have to think the past is not fixed, that we can change the past. What do y'all think? Do you think the past can be changed? Yes? No? Maybe so? It's a hard question, right? I mean, how do we even answer it? Unless one of you here is a time traveler, and you can answer it for us, you know? It certainly seems like the past can't be fixed. Like, that's our intuition, right? Because if you had gone back in time and done something, like, our normal picture of time working this way would tell us that's the way it's always been. Like, that is what happened, and we just didn't know. Like, that's what happened. But that's always been part of the timeline. So this is weird. I think this paradox falls out of this idea that once something has happened, like, it can't be changed. Like, that's how it's been. That's what's happened in the universe. But maybe we don't have to accept that. maybe we can just, maybe if we buy some of these science fiction views, maybe we can think, whenever you do something in the past, it just creates a new reality, a new timeline or something. But that's really weird. I don't know how that happens or why that would happen. Maybe that's just a storytelling device to help us make sense of all these weird time travel stories. I don't know. So this is kind of like a weird abstract problem, but there are more concrete paradoxes that we can talk about too. For example, this is a famous one, the grandfather paradox. Okay? Imagine the following situation. Suppose you want to kill your grandfather, but he died before you were born. So you build a time machine and go back to kill him when he was a young man. According to your abilities, you can kill him. Right? Let's say you're strong enough to do it, or you have a gun. It's possible that you could kill him. Right? But we need to recognize that your very existence, the reason you're able to live, travel back to the past, and plot to kill your grandfather in the present, depends on your grandfather having lived and fathered your parents, right? Or one of your parents. Without your grandfather existing, one of your parents wouldn't have been born, and therefore you wouldn't have been born, right? So according to logic, it would appear you can't kill your grandfather, since you are existing now, plotting to kill him and end his life. So you can, but you cannot kill him. So do you see the issue here? Is it possible for you to go into the past and kill one of your parents or your grandfather before you're born? You see what the issue is? You existing now, the reason that you're existing now is because your grandfather or your parent or whoever lived to a certain time. But if you go back and tried to kill them before that time, first of all, is that possible? And second of all, if you could do that, what would happen to you? Would you just disappear? Like right after you killed them? Because if you killed them, then you wouldn't have been born. Right?
If you stayed in that kind of like time zone where you killed them, you just kind of stayed in the past, what happened then? Would you still die?
I don't know. So there are two questions here. One, is it possible for you to kill your grandfather before he fathers one of your parents? And second of all, if you could, what would happen? So you see the paradox here? If your grandfather had actually died, you wouldn't have been alive to go back in time to kill him. This is a weird paradox, right? I think it's captured very well in this image. I'm born. I create a time machine at some point in the future. I go into the past, kill my grandfather. But that means my father's not born, which means I'm not born, which means I couldn't have created the time machine, which means I couldn't have gone into the past. Which means if you couldn't have gone into the past, then you couldn't have killed your grandfather, so he was alive, and it's a weird loop of strange logic and impossibility. So how do we resolve this? Can you kill your grandfather or can you not? Is this making anybody's head hurt yet? How have other movies and shows dealt with something like this? I know how one has. Have you all seen the movie Looper? Okay, this is a movie, I think it was directed by Ryan Johnson. It has, what's his name in it? I can't remember his name. Well, it has Bruce Willis in it, another famous actor. But basically what ends up happening is, in one of the scenes in the movie, the guy is chasing his older self, and the younger self dies, and when the younger self dies, the older self just disappears immediately. Because if the younger self dies, the older self couldn't have been, at that point in time, because the younger self had died. So is that how it works? Like if we go back into the past and kill our grandfather, will we just disappear? Because our existence would have been an impossibility? Yeah, exactly. And then the problem is, how the fuck does that work? Yeah. The Flash again. All right.
Yeah, they kind of did this with like him saving his mother from being killed, but then he realized like, okay, that really screwed up the future. Like then he's like no longer the Flash because he
Or-
didn't get struck by lightning because his mother didn't die.
Right, exactly.
So then he has to go back to the past and kill his mother, so it turns out that he's the killer of his mother, and
And he was always the killer of his mother, right?
So it was
Yeah.
the whole thing, and
Yeah, it's weird, right?
There was an episode of Futurama that dealt with this paradox. He tried to save his own grandfather from being killed in World War II, I think. But then he accidentally gets him killed, and then it turns out Fry is his own grandfather. So.
Right. That shows up in another movie, which is one of my favorite time travel movies ever, called Predestination. You should all watch it. It's got Ethan Hawke. And the premise of the movie is time travel is invented, and there's a secret organization that tries to use time travel to make sure things don't get fucked up from other people using time travel in weird ways, and they try to use time travel to solve problems and keep things from happening and keep other things happening to make the timeline make sense. It ends up in that movie that it's a situation very similar to Fry. The guy goes back into the past, and I don't want to spoil the whole ending for you, but it ends up being a weird causal loop, paradoxical thing of them being their own parent or something, which is really weird. And yeah. So this is a weird paradox. How do we solve it? I don't know. Maybe it can't be solved. Maybe that's why it's called a paradox. And there are other ones that we can talk about too. I got a few more for you. Let's talk about this one that one of my professors introduced to me when I was your age, known as the rabbit's foot. This is another weird one. Okay? Here's the situation. Suppose you decide to go back in time to cheer up your younger self, right? Maybe you have a time machine and you're like, I'm going to go back to when I was 17 and I'm going to tell her, it's okay, your heart was broken. Don't worry about it. Things will get better, right? To do this, you plan to give your younger self your lucky rabbit's foot that you received when you were a child, okay? You travel back in time, give your younger self your lucky rabbit's foot, and head back to the present. Your younger self holds on to this rabbit's foot until they decide when they are an adult to travel back and give it to their younger self. But a problem arises. When you received the rabbit's foot as a child, it was new. It was in fine shape. Beautiful, clean rabbit's foot. Logically, the rabbit's foot must be in fine shape when your younger self goes back in time and gives it to their younger self. But that's not how aging works, right? Let's say you received a lucky rabbit's foot as a child. As you get older, it's going to get dirty and dingy, right? And it's going to age. But if it's the case that you had gotten it from yourself originally when you were a child, and it was lucky and new and nice, does that mean it can't age? Because once you get older, you're going to go back in time and give it to yourself, and it was new when you first got it. You see the problem here? The issue? Normally things age, they get dirty and dingy and stuff as time goes on and dusty. But when you received the rabbit's foot when you were a child, it was nice and new. So somehow it must be nice and new when you, as an older person, goes back in time and gives it to their younger self. But that's not how things work in reality, right? So, like when you toss your rabbit's foot to your younger self, does it spontaneously de-age or something? Or does it not age at all? Can it not age? Because it was always the case that you gave yourself the rabbit's foot when you were a child. You see the problem, the weird paradox?
Or in the process of the time traveling.
It de-ages? See, that's interesting because that would mean the rabbit's foot doesn't act like your own body, right? Because when you go back in time, you're not de-aging, right? You're staying who you are. You have the same length of hair, everything, right? So, yeah, this is a weird thing, right? How do we explain this? I don't know how to explain it. It's fucking weird. Time travel is weird. all these problems arise. Now this problem goes away if we think that perhaps every time somebody goes into the past, a new timeline emerges or something, right? Maybe that is how it goes. I don't know. Who's to say? Until we invent time travel. We probably won't ever do that, though, unfortunately. Seems kind of hard. So, I don't know what to say about this rabbit's foot thing. What do y'all think? How can the rabbit's foot be nice and pristine after you've held on to it for 30 years? You know? Yeah.
Because you also haven't at the same time. Because if you were an adult and you got that rabbit's foot, like, well, you were an adult, you held on to that for so long. But
Yeah.
the kid never had that rabbit's foot, and the kid received that rabbit's foot as sort of like brand new in their own like time frame when they were given it as like a gift.
Okay, so
So-
you're thinking of a different timeline splitting off then,
Yeah.
right? Okay. But if we don't think about then this paradox arises, right? Because it was always the case that in the past you had received it from your older self, but then as you hold on to it for those 30, 40 years, it's not going to be in the shape that it's supposed to be in when you go back and give it to yourself. So yeah, it's a weird thing. I don't know. And there are other weird questions again that arise. I think I have two more for you. Has anybody here ever heard of the Fermi paradox? Any astronomers in the room? Scientists? The Fermi paradox is this. Bless you. According to our best guess, our best knowledge of the universe, it seems to be infinite. There seem to be uncountable number of planets and galaxies and solar systems out there. Given that, it's really weird that we haven't run into aliens yet. Because if the universe is infinite like we think it is, certainly intelligent life, according to the odds, would have emerged somewhere else in the universe. That's what the mathematics tell us, the odds, right? Given an infinite number of planets, certainly it's a statistical certainty that life emerged somewhere else. Well, if that's the case, why haven't we run into any other forms of intelligent life? That's weird. This is called the Fermi paradox. Well, there's a Fermi-like paradox that arises with regards to time travel. If time travel ever does become a reality, then it's highly likely people will travel back to the past, right? They'll travel all sorts of places, past, future, whatever. But have you met any time travelers? Not that you know of, right? I don't see a bunch of time travelers in this room. So that begs the question, right? Where are they? I've never met a time traveler, I don't think. You probably don't think you have either. It would seem like time travel is this really cool thing, and people would definitely use it to go back into the past, right? If they could. So where are they? Are they hiding? Or are we supposed to take from this fact that we haven't met any that time travel never gets invented? Or maybe are we supposed to take from that it gets outlawed or something? I don't know. What do you think?
Well, if time traveling creates a different timeline, we wouldn't see them.
We wouldn't see him, I guess. Yeah. Well, yeah. But, that's weird. That opens up a whole other bunch of other questions for me. I'm still dubious on this timeline thing, because I don't know how that would work, or what would cause that to happen. Anyway, the basic point is this. if time travel does get invented, it would seem like we should have met a time traveler by now, but we haven't. So maybe that implies it never gets invented, or it's outlawed, or something like that, which would be sad, right? Time travel's cool. So we would expect to see some time travelers here if it does get invented in the future. I don't want to think about time travel not being invented, but maybe it's good if it doesn't get invented. Okay, one more. This is a weird one. This is based on the idea, again, that you can't change what's happened in the past. Your heart got broken when you were 15, right? Let's presume you can't go back and change that, even if you had a time machine. Well, what always gets brought up in these discussions around time travel? If you had a time machine, would you go back in time and kill baby Hitler? Right? Have you ever talked to your friends about this or heard this? Right? And you're like, yeah, I would strangle baby Hitler. And other people are like, no, I couldn't kill a baby. Right? And you talk about this. If the past can't be changed, that seems to imply that there are like miracles that are happening, like in a lot of points in human history. Think about it like this. Let's assume for a moment that time travel is possible, but because the past has already happened and is fixed, changing the past is impossible. If this is true, and if time travel ever does get invented, then one of the things people may try to do is go back in time and change the past, like kill Hitler. However, because they cannot change the past, all of these time travelers will fail in achieving their goals. It would seem then that the past is full of miracles. For example, time travel gets invented, we want to go back in time and kill Hitler and prevent the Holocaust. If the past can't be changed, the past is full of like a billion time travelers all standing point blank away from Hitler and their bullets just missing. Because he can't die, right, at that moment. And for other similar things, right? Like imagine you try to kill your grandfather, you try to kill another person in the past, or you try to do another thing. All of these things have to fail because that's not the way things played out, right? According to the objective timeline. That's weird, right? It would seem like the past is full of miracles then, because logically things can't be changed.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So for you at least, would you go back in time and put him at a different school so he doesn't get bullied? And then there wouldn't be a killing involved?
Yeah, maybe we let him into art school, and the whole future's changed. I don't know.
Who knows?
But is that even a possibility? Right? Like, try as you might to get him into art school, like his application gets lost and he doesn't get in. Or, you go back in time and you try it another time and you try to meet with the dean of the art school and the dean has like a weird sickness that day and you can't meet him or something. And it's just like you fail in all your efforts.
Get rid of the dean in general.
Yeah. But of course you fail at that too because the dean didn't die, right, on that day. All these things. So this is weird, right? If time travel does get invented and things can't be changed, it would seem like the past is full of all these miraculous things happening. And that's weird. A lot of people don't believe in miracles, right? But given this scenario, there are probably a lot of miracles that have happened in the past. Okay. Is this interesting to any of you? I'm probably not going to test you on any of this, so this is more like a fun day. But I hope you found some of these paradoxes thought-provoking, right? You should go and talk to your friends about the grandfather paradox later. Be like, hey, can you kill your grandfather, before he gives birth to your mom or whatever? See what they say. It's weird. Time travel's weird. It opens up all of these problems, all of these issues. I think that's all I have for you. Yeah. Does anybody have any questions about this stuff? Otherwise, I'll let you go early today. No? Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for coming and letting me screw with your brain a little bit. Please sign the attendance sheet before you leave. Otherwise, I will see you on Monday. We're starting a new unit, right? Yeah. One thing about that reading, it's going to be the most difficult one you do all semester. So if you don't understand a word of it, don't freak out. Okay? I'll explain it all to you in class.